The flash of magnesium powder had long since settled when the technician, Gregory Darnell, leaned over the ancient glass plate for the fourth time that afternoon. His hands, gloved and steady, hovered just inches above the cold, rectangular frame now resting atop a velvet-lined table in the Penbrook Archives restoration room. The dim winter light filtered through the frosted windows, casting an eerie glow over the photographs waiting to be catalogued. But Gregory wasn't looking at just any photo. This one had stopped him mid-task an hour ago, and something about it wouldn't let him move on. It was a school portrait. 27 children, their faces blurred by the soft focus of a 19th-century lens. Laced collars, woolen knickers, parted hair, stiff shoulders, standard for a class image of the era. The studio backdrop featured faded velvet curtains and a fake Greco-Roman column, now ghostly in grayscale. Most of the children were looking directly at the lens, their expressions neutral, bored, or subtly anxious. But in the back row, third from the right, one boy stood out. Elric Munday, Gregory muttered, checking the penciled note on the archival envelope again. The boy's face was drawn, his lips pressed tightly, his dark eyes avoiding the camera, turned slightly left as if something outside the frame had caught his attention. His hands were folded neatly at his waist. Nothing unusual at first glance, and yet Gregory exhaled sharply. The shadow beneath the boy's boots defied every law of light. He looked again, turning the plate under the desk lamp, slowly adjusting the angle to reduce glare. The other children's shadows were uniform, stretching leftward from the gaslight placement noted in the Harrow Studio's ledger. But Elric's shadow pointed right, cleanly, unmistakably, like a defiant contradiction in a world that demanded symmetry. At first, Gregory thought it was a trick of the emulsion or a double exposure, but he'd inspected enough glass plates to know better. The shadow's edges were too sharp, the detail, especially around the boy's boots, too precise. He leaned in closer. The texture of the wood floorboards, the folds in Elric's socks, even the scuffed heel on the left shoe, all aligned with the body. But the shadow seemed slightly offset, as if it weren't truly his. Gregory's breath caught as he traced the shadow's length. Where most of the children's outlines faded into the studio's dark floor, Elric's shadow stood out in high contrast. It was darker, thicker, as though it had been pressed harder into the surface, like a stain that resisted fading. And then there was the most troubling part. The feet in the shadow weren't pointed like Elric's real shoes. They were angled outward, in a stance different than the boy's own. A small difference, yes, but not one possible by accident. "This has to be a misalignment," Gregory whispered, though even as he said it, he didn't believe it. He checked the glass for tampering. No cracks, no bubbling in the emulsion. He reached for the camera to document it and began taking high-resolution scans. With each click, he repositioned the plate slightly, hoping it might explain the distortion. That's when it happened. The shadow moved. It wasn't dramatic, not even obvious unless you were staring directly at the hem of the boy's pant leg. But Gregory froze. He leaned in, blinking slowly, then adjusted the plate back. Again, and again. The shadow shifted, no more than a fraction of an inch, but consistently, subtly, against the grain of the glass itself. He gripped the edges tighter. The room felt colder than before. He logged the movement, noting each shift, photographing every slight angle change. He replayed the documentation process, searching for dust or light refraction. But there was no plausible answer. The physical plate was not warped. The emulsion was intact. The lighting remained consistent. And yet the shadow acted like a living thing, tilting, rotating ever so slightly, not with the glass, but in response to being observed. Unease gnawed at him. He stepped back and pulled the original museum file. There it was, the 1931 rediscovery entry. Curators had marked the photo as unusual but not anomalous. But a red-inked note caught his eye. Technician W. Hall reported sensation of movement in the subject's silhouette during cleaning. No evidence of double exposure. Plate sealed for preservation, 1933. Gregory swallowed. He wasn't the first to notice it. Turning to the restoration log, he saw the last handling date was 1968, during a rare public exhibition titled Children of the Collodion Age. He flipped to the museum's report. The gallery closed 3 days early after 2 patrons reportedly fainted near the display. One man had been found slumped on the floor, mumbling about a second face in the reflection glass of the frame. The exhibit was dismantled quietly, and the plate returned to storage. No further showings had occurred since. Gregory reached out, touched the side of the plate through his glove. The glass felt colder than it should, even for winter. The boy in the photo remained motionless, unblinking. But the shadow, it no longer felt like it belonged to him. It seemed to loom beside him, not beneath. It studied him, followed him, or perhaps led him. Gregory didn't know why he whispered it aloud, but as his breath fogged the glass, he heard his own voice crack. The shadow in question did not mirror the child, but seemed to study him. The boy wouldn't stop trembling. Inside the narrow, cold studio of B. Harrow Son on a soot-gray Thursday afternoon in February of 1879, Elric Munday stood stiffly between 2 taller boys, his hands folded tight over his stomach. The children had been arranged in rows by height, shoes dusted, collars straightened, and faces scrubbed red with cold water and a rough cloth. The photographer's son, Bernard Harrow, Jr., adjusted the height of the camera's iron legs and glanced up toward the rows of students. "Elric," he called, narrowing his eyes. "Face the lens, please." But Elric didn't respond. His pale face, dusted with freckles, remained turned slightly toward the right wall, away from the camera. The other boys looked uneasy. A few exchanged glances. One in the front row coughed softly, as if the silence had grown too thick. In the corner, Callum Griggs, the studio's assistant, jotted something in the ledger. Session, Alder's Hollow Primary. Light irregular. One subject uncooperative. "Just take the exposure," Harrow muttered. "We'll fix it in varnish if need be." The exposure began, a slow, 20-second breath of stillness as the lens remained open. The lamplight cast soft shadows to the left, stretching out long and even across the studio floor. Everyone held still, everyone but Elric. Griggs noticed it first. The boy's hands, still folded, had started to twitch. Not a shake of nerves, but a rhythmic pulse, fingers clenching and unclenching as if mimicking something else entirely. "Do you see that?" Griggs whispered to Harrow. Before the photographer could answer, a sharp crack sounded from the gas lamp hanging overhead. The flame inside sputtered, briefly dimming the left side of the room. Several children flinched, and one small boy in the front row broke pose with a gasp. Harrow groaned. "We'll have to reshoot." "Griggs, mark the session. We'll bring them back tomorrow." Elric didn't move, but when Harrow approached to guide the children out, he noticed the boy's feet had shifted, slightly apart, toes angled in. "Elric," he said, kneeling to meet the boy's eye. "Are you feeling all right?" The boy finally turned to face him. His eyes were pale gray, almost colorless and wide with something Harrow couldn't name. "I don't see it," Elric whispered. "See what?" "My shadow." The silence was instant and heavy. Harrow rose slowly, a chill crawling up his spine. "We'll have your father pick you up." Later that evening, Harrow and Griggs processed the glass plate in the studio's back room, swabbing emulsion and setting the chemical bath with care. When the image finally appeared, its ghost-like grays and blacks shimmering across the wet surface, Griggs leaned in, frowning. "Harrow, come look." The portrait showed what they expected. Children in their best clothes, hands clasped, faces solemn. But on closer inspection a discrepancy became clear. The gas lamp had cast all the shadows toward the left wall, except for one. Elric's shadow ran to the right. It wasn't faint or hazy. It was solid, sharp-edged, almost too detailed. Where the other children's silhouettes were soft around the edges, Elric's had articulation, individual fingers, the seam of his collar, even the outline of his ears. "He never even turned to face the lens," Griggs murmured, "and yet his shadow is." They stared in silence for nearly a full minute. "We say nothing," Harrow said finally. "Session disrupted. Returned next day. That's what the ledger will say." The next day, Elric returned with the others and the portrait was redone without incident. That plate was used in the school's official print. The other, marked with a wax seal, was shelved in a locked cabinet labeled "Do Not Reuse." But something had already started. 3 days later, Griggs stayed late to clean the lenses. He found the first marginal note in the school register, left open on the studio counter by the schoolmaster, Mr. Felton. "E.M. claims not to see his own shadow. Sent home early." The note was scratched faintly in the margin beside Elric's name. By morning it had vanished, inked over by a solid black blot. Years passed. The portrait remained in storage, but rumors persisted. The cleaner boy at the studio refused to go near the cabinet after dusk. "Something moves in there," he once told Griggs, pale and shaking. "Something watches from the glass." In 1944, long after the studio closed, a sealed envelope was found tucked behind a drawer at the Penbrook archive. Inside, wrapped in oil paper, was the original studio ledger, its ink faded but legible. February 13th. Light waning. Subject, E. Munday. Session disrupted, returned next day. No further explanation. In the decades that followed, photographic experts from Boston and even New Haven were invited to study the original plate, which had found its way into the Penbrook Archive's rare collection. Under controlled conditions, the negative was examined by gaslight, sodium lamps, and, later, electric bulbs. No fault was found in the plate's composition. One technician from New Haven insisted the misalignment was a flaw in the exposure process. "Shadows can shift if the light source flickers mid-exposure," he said, confident. But when he attempted to reproduce the anomaly using the same camera model, the same lens, and even the same type of plate, the results were uniform, except for the Elric negative. In one documented case, a technician swore the shadow moved slightly during a cleaning session. "It twitched," he said, breathless. "I swear, its fingers moved." But there was no proof, no witnesses. By 1951, the academic consensus was fractured. Some blamed collodion inconsistencies. Others whispered of emotional trauma, of children so deeply disturbed they split from their own reflections. Yet none could explain how the photographic process, fixed, chemical, absolute, could yield a moving shadow on a still plate. And none could explain why, across all 12 other portraits taken that month at B. Harrow and Son, only Elric's showed any flaw at all. The other children's shadows remained unchanged across all exposures. The shutter clicked closed at exactly 2:40 p.m. on February 13, 1879. A slow breath exhaled through Callum Griggs' teeth as he lifted his head from behind the camera hood, blinking against the dull gray afternoon light that filtered weakly through the high studio windows. Outside, sleet whispered against the glass panes like fingernails tapping wood. Inside, the air hung thick with the sharp scent of collodion and the faint tang of soot clinging to the boys' damp coats. Callum stood still for a moment, his hands hovering near the lens of the Voigtlander Petzval, his prized instrument. He had been trained to notice the slightest flaw in posture, the smallest fidget, the faintest blink during the long exposures. 20 seconds was enough time for a world to change in silver nitrate. And yet, as he looked at the boy in the third row, Elric Munday, something gnawed at the back of his mind. The child hadn't blinked, not once. He moved around the frame of the camera and began unscrewing the plate holder with practiced fingers, careful not to smudge the fragile emulsion. The boys in the portrait fidgeted in place, waiting for dismissal. Most coughed or sniffed, adjusting caps and scarves, but Elric stood perfectly still, hands folded, head turned slightly, Not toward the lens, but just off to the right, as though listening to something the others could not hear. "Thank you, lads." "That's all," Callum said, voice low but steady. The boys began to disperse, their shoes echoing on the wooden floor as they shuffled out the side door. Elric lingered. His eyes remained unfocused, watching something across the room that wasn't there. Then, as if hearing a bell no one else did, he turned abruptly and left. Callum stood alone now in the dim studio, holding the loaded plate like it was a living thing. He didn't know why, but he felt the need to process it immediately. By candlelight in the back darkroom, the chemical bath hissed softly as the image bloomed to life. First the outlines, then the familiar uniforms, then faces, and then something wrong. He leaned closer, holding his breath. The children were all accounted for. 11 boys, neatly lined rows. All shadows fell to the left, elongated across the floor, angled by the studio's fixed gaslight. Except one. Elric's shadow ran rightward, opposite the others. Perfectly clear, perfectly wrong. Callum's mouth went dry. He blinked hard, rubbed at the plate with a soft cloth, thinking perhaps it was residue or dust. But nothing changed. Worse, on closer inspection, Elric's shadow was not a vague smudge, but detailed. More detailed than the boy himself. The outline of his fingers was visible, splayed wide as if bracing or reaching. But Elric's real hands, clasped at his waist. Callum stepped back from the table, heart thudding now in his chest. The walls of the studio seemed closer than they were a moment ago. He looked over his shoulder, expecting, what, exactly? A trick of light? Someone having a laugh? No one was there. Later that night, he wrote in the studio logbook with a shaky hand, "Light irregular." Subject Munday did not face lens. Shadow anomaly present, further inspection required. He didn't speak of it to be. Harrow, the studio's master photographer. Not yet. Harrow was precise, skeptical, and quick to anger over wasted plates. Callum knew better than to raise alarms without cause, but he couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that shadow, not following the child, but watching him. A strange thought, absurd even, but it felt real. Days passed before he could bring himself to share the plate with someone else. That someone came years later, Dr. Isabel Perrin, a visiting archivist cataloging the Harrow Son collection for the Penbrook archive. She found the plate stored in a weathered cedar box labeled only by date. "What on earth is this?" she murmured, holding the negative to the light. Callum, long since retired, had never spoken of it again. But Perrin's curiosity was relentless. She documented her findings in a field note written in careful script. The shadow seems to possess details absent in the subject. The fingers are unbound, the face forward. In contrast, the boy in the portrait is withdrawn, his posture restrained. The separation between the two is not only physical, but expressive. In 1992, the plate was scanned using high-resolution digital mapping. Technicians expected to confirm a flaw in exposure, perhaps a dual capture or lens refraction. Instead, they found further confirmation of something impossible. Elric's hands were not only clasped, they were tightly gripped, so much so that the knuckles showed strain. And yet the shadow's hands were open, fingers extended and relaxed. No exposure error could explain that. Not with a 20-second capture time, not with fixed lighting. The image had no double outline, no streaking, no halation, no tampering. And, perhaps most tellingly, there were no records of post-production editing in 1879. The idea was laughable. That year, wet plate collodion photography required precision. The emulsion, once poured, could not be touched. Any physical interference, especially at the shadow layer, would lift the silver or cause blots. But Elric's plate? Pristine. No lift, no streak, no blemish. There was a quiet consensus among those who examined it closely and dared to write about it. Something had posed in that photograph that wasn't the boy. Or perhaps something had separated from him, just for that moment, just long enough to leave its imprint behind. No one could say what had caused it, and no adjustments were recorded in post. That was not possible in 1879. The photograph surfaced again in 1903, quietly, unexpectedly. It was during inventory week at the Exeter Institute's archive, a gray, rain-soaked afternoon where the gaslight flickered more often than not, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and old paper. A junior intern named Leonard Brack, no older than 20, hunched over a leather-bound catalog of ecclesiastical prints. His assignment was tedious. Label, date, and restore any early gelatin silver exposures of 19th-century church interiors for the seasonal exhibition. He reached for an unmarked sleeve, its backing board crumbling at the corners. The image inside was of St. Martin's Nave, taken sometime in the 1880s. Rows of pews, leaded windows, tall wooden beams fading into shadow, and there, just near the altar rail, something stood out. Leonard narrowed his eyes. A child-sized shadow lay across the stone floor, distinct in its form, clear in its shape, yet entirely unattached to any body or source of light. He turned his head, checked the reverse for notes. Nothing. No name, no signature. Just a silent church interior with something, someone, lurking in its stillness. He shifted the plate under the lamp. The shadow didn't blur with the angle. It held, sharp and deliberate. He brought the photo to his supervisor, Mr. Roland Darren, who frowned, then grew visibly pale as he studied it. "This isn't possible," Darren murmured, voice dry as dust. "There's no one there." But there's something watching. No further action was taken. The photo was quietly shelved under the misfiled category Architectural Curiosities, Miscellaneous. Years passed. The church photo was mostly forgotten until 1911, when a different kind of mind began to circle the growing rumors around the Elric Munday Plate. Dr. Reynolds Swern was not a man of superstition. As professor of optical analysis at Wexbridge College, he had built his reputation dismantling fraudulent spirit photographs and so-called ghost lenses with ruthless clarity. He had even published a series titled The Infallibility of Light, in which he declared most anomalies were manifest failures of common sense, not reality. But something about the Penbrook case irritated him, not because he believed it, but because no one could disprove it. Swern requested access to the original negative of the 1879 school photo, and after several months of petitions and a quiet recommendation from a museum board member, he was granted 3 hours in a controlled viewing room with the plate, 2 sodium arc lamps, and a borrowed spectrograph from the engineering department. The room was cold, clinical, and windowless. As Swern arranged the lamps at precise 45-degree angles and inserted the plate into the glass holder, his assistant, Thomas Elwick, a graduate student with an eye for detail, stood ready with a notebook. "Set it low," Swern instructed. "We want full absorption patterning." The light came on. Nothing changed, and then, quietly, disturbingly, the surface temperature of the table beneath the plate began to fall. Swern frowned. "Check the thermometer." Elwick, already scribbling, read it aloud. 62 degrees. Now 60. Now 59. "Not possible," Swern muttered. He looked through the spectrograph again. The lines around the boy's body were faint, but those around the shadow were denser, darker, pulling more light than they reflected. "This isn't refraction," he said. "This is consumption." "Consumption, sir?" Swern didn't answer immediately. He turned the lamp intensity up by 2 degrees. The shadow remained unchanged. "It's absorbing," he said finally. "Not reacting. Not bouncing light." Drawing it inward, Thomas stared at him, pale. "Like a void?" "Worse," Swern said. "Like a collector." Word of the experiment leaked, as such things often do. The Wexbridge Gazette ran a single-line teaser buried on page 6. Professor Swern finds anomaly consumes light, unlike any shadow seen before. 2 months later, a physicist from France, Henrietta Vale, visited Wexbridge for a quiet collaboration. Her field was thermography, and she proposed testing the Elric plate for temperature shift anomalies. They conducted their test in a refrigeration chamber using freshly calibrated mercury strips placed around the photographic glass. At baseline, the room was held at 62 degrees Fahrenheit. After the lamps were dimmed and the chamber sealed, they waited. Vale watched the readings closely. "We're down 2 degrees," she said. 59, 58. There was no mold on the plate, no condensation, no cracks or air gaps that might allow for environmental interference, and yet wherever the shadow lay across the glass, the ambient temperature dipped without explanation. Swern leaned in slowly. "It's colder," he whispered, "and nothing else is." That same week, the National Registry of Anomalous Materials, usually reserved for meteor fragments, unexplained alloys, and misbehaving radiocrystals, quietly issued a Category 4 classification for the Elric glass plate. It was stamped with the code NPM-1879-0213 and filed under non-photographic phenomena. Still, the registry avoided making public claims. No agency wanted to be seen declaring a haunted image. Years passed, but the shadow did not. In 1918, a military reconnaissance photo taken in Belgium, of all places, was submitted to an archivist for routine filing. The landscape was empty, a broken cathedral shell in the background. But near the frame's left edge, a dark figure stood, boy-shaped, misaligned, sharp against the rubble. No children had been within kilometers of that photo's location. The analyst reviewing the print wrote in pencil, "Form appears again." Same angle, same stance. Then, silence. No link was ever made publicly. Elric Munday's name remained absent from all records beyond 1882. The last time Dr. Swern ever spoke publicly on the matter was during a university dinner in 1926. Over roast duck and weak wine, someone had asked if he still believed it was a photographic trick. He set down his fork slowly. "No," he said, staring at the tablecloth. "It's not a trick. It's a presence." "What kind of presence?" the guest asked. Swern shook his head. "One that doesn't want to be explained." By then, the archives had already sealed the original Elric plate in a reinforced lead cabinet beneath Penbrook's west wing. Still, reports came in. Shadows that leaned the wrong way, cold spots in dark rooms, cracks in plates that had been whole. None ever mentioned Elric by name. But they didn't have to, except for the fact that they all appeared in photographs Elric never posed for. "It's not a defect," whispered Dr. Lionel Thatch, pressing his calloused fingers against the frosted edge of the original glass plate. The lab's dim sodium arc lamp cast a pale gleam across the archival table, illuminating the 2 figures immortalized in the image, Elric Munday, and the shadow that shouldn't be his. Outside, a steady snow fell on the slate roofs of Penbrook Institute, but inside the temperature felt colder than the season justified. Thatch adjusted his spectacles, heart ticking louder with each passing second. He had seen anomalies before, chemical streaks, silver nitrate burns, broken emulsions, but nothing like this. He'd come into the case reluctantly, dragged into it by archivist Charles Aldwin, who'd been cataloging photographic anomalies for a side exhibit. "It's probably nothing," Aldwin had said 2 weeks ago. "Just some old soot on a failed collodion print." But look closer now Thatch had, and he couldn't look away. The first theory, the one clung to by the cautious, was chemical error. Exposure layering, possibly a backlit anomaly caused by aging silver nitrate or inconsistent iodine washing. But B. Harrow and Son had processed dozens of group prints from that same February batch. Not a single one showed this kind of contradiction. The emulsion on Elric's plate was flawless, uniform, intact, and impossibly clean for something that had allegedly passed through multiple hands across 5 decades. He turned to the lab assistant, Jules Merton, a lean, meticulous man in his early 30s. "Run the scan again. I want to see if the hand shifts." Merton hesitated, fingers hovering over the plate scanner's controls. "You mean the hand in the shadow?" Thatch nodded. "It shouldn't be splayed." The boy's hands are folded. The scan began with a mechanical whir. The blue beam passed slowly over the glass, inch by inch, casting the shapes into sharper relief on the monitor beside them. Thatch leaned in. There it was again, Elric's body facing slightly away, but the shadow turned frontward, open-palmed. The fingers in the shadow looked deliberate, as if reaching toward the lens. "This isn't a light artifact," Thatch muttered. "It's a contradiction in perspective." They'd tested it for tampering, too. Chemical swabs, microscopic emulsion checks, no sign of physical interference. No lampblack, no soot, and certainly no ink. Still, others clung to darker possibilities. Abuse, they said. Maybe Elric had been manipulated by a cruel adult, his image altered afterward in a twisted form of punishment or warning. Thatch rejected the idea almost instantly. "The boy's expression," he argued once during a lecture at Morningshaw College, "isn't one of fear. It's detachment, as if, whatever was happening, he wasn't part of it." The more fringe theorists, of course, were never quiet. In 1959, Corin Wess, an eccentric but respected researcher in optical metaphysics, published a 42-page thesis titled "The Disassociated Shadow, Material Self, and Reflective Disjunction." His claim was simple, if troubling, that Elric Munday had become severed from his own shadow. By trauma, Wess wrote, or possession. The body remains, but the tether to reflection has frayed. Wess had compiled dozens of photographs from Alder's Hollow over the next 2 decades. Interior shots of empty town halls, barn windows, even reflections in pond surfaces, all featuring what he claimed was a child-shaped shadow, off-angle and misaligned. The disturbing part: these images spanned into the 1920s and 1930s, long after Elric's disappearance. Thatch hadn't believed it until he saw one for himself. It was a 1912 photograph of a butcher's shop on Lorne Street, 5 blocks from where Elric's school once stood. Taken to advertise the reopening after a fire, the image showed hanging cuts of meat, a sharpened blade on the block, and behind the counter, cast on the far wall, was the silhouette of a boy. No children were present at the time. According to the records, the photo was taken on a Sunday. The shop had been closed to the public. When Thatch laid the 2 shadows side by side, Elric's from the original 1879 plate and the one from the butcher shop, they matched in proportions. But the newer shadow stood straighter, taller. "Is it aging?" Merton asked him once, studying the comparison under red light. Thatch didn't answer. He didn't have one. One evening, driven by both dread and curiosity, he requested access to the town's building registry and began mapping the photographs across Alder's Hollow's timeline. The shadow showed up in 4 confirmed instances. The last, dated 1933, showed it standing on the bell tower steps of St. Abel's Church. Same tilt, same slight lean to the left. But now it was nearly the size of a grown man. "Why does it keep showing up in glass?" Merton asked. Thatch exhaled, dry-mouthed. "Maybe it can't help it. Maybe it doesn't know what it is." Later that night, after the Institute had gone quiet, Thatch lingered by the plate in the viewing room. He watched it under low light, examining the boundary where Elric's figure ended and the shadow began. The edge wasn't sharp. It almost bled, like smoke, or breath on cold glass. He blinked. The palm in the shadow looked wider. The fingers longer? Thatch stood back, pulse quickening. "No," he whispered. We would have seen that. But the room remained still. That week, he filed a report for the Registry of Anomalous Materials. His conclusion was cautious but pointed. The entity behaves not as a cast shadow, but as a localized event of absorption, one which appears capable of adaptation over time. Merton was less careful in his wording. In a private note left taped to the viewing cabinet, he wrote simply, "We keep looking for proof that the shadow belongs to Elric." But what if it never did? What if it was never his shadow at all? Theories continued to circulate. Photochemical fluke, emotional trauma, ritual disruption. But none accounted for the later photographs. And none accounted for the fact that in later photos, the shadow begins to look older. The mercury thermometer on the west wall read 62 degrees Fahrenheit when Alfred Lyle unlocked the iron grate to cabinet C17. He worked alone that night as he always preferred. No distractions, no conversations, just the low hum of the overhead lights and the faint rustle of paper inside the archive's stone belly. The Penbrook Archive Museum basement was a cold, windowless warren of catalog drawers, faded documents, and long-forgotten curiosities. But tonight, something felt different the moment the latch clicked open. Alfred exhaled, his breath barely visible, and reached for the thin-gloved bundle inside. The item in question was labeled Glass Negative, February 1879, Alder's Hollow, Class Portrait, Munday, Elric, Anomaly Noted. He had rehoused dozens of these historical artifacts, but this one had been flagged for special handling, not for its value, but because of an old note scribbled decades prior in the museum ledger. Plate reactive under light and temperature variance. Do not display unsupervised. At precisely 3:17 a.m., the motion-sensitive bulb above the stairwell buzzed and flicked to life. Alfred froze. He hadn't moved from his position. No draft, no rodents, no logical reason. He turned slowly toward the stairs, empty, silent, just concrete steps leading up into darkness. A second later, he heard it. Slap, slap, slap. Bare feet, wet, unhurried, advancing across stone. Alfred spun, heart thudding. "Hello?" His voice barely echoed beyond his own ears. No answer. The sound had stopped as suddenly as it began. With a shaking hand, he slid the glass plate from its housing. It was heavier than expected. Colder, too. Not just room temperature cold, but biting. Fresh from ice cold. The thermometer now read 49 degrees Fahrenheit, a 13-degree drop in under 2 minutes. He laid the plate under the inspection lamp. There they were, the children, frozen in neat Victorian rows. Soft curls, parted hair, buttoned collars, all posed dutifully toward the left. And there, third from the right, Elric Munday, unsmiling, hands folded, gaze averted. But his shadow. Alfred leaned in. The shadow was darker than the others, thicker. It faced toward the viewer, not away like the rest. Its fingers, yes, they were spread open, unlike the boy's clasped hands. He squinted. There were creases in the shadow's palm as though etched with intent. Suddenly, a soft tap sounded against the plate. Not from the glass itself, but atop it. A faint handprint appeared in the frost. 5 small fingers, the size of a child's. Alfred backed away from the desk, his chair scraping loudly against the tile. The handprint grew clearer, moisture spreading outward in a faint ring, as if it had just been placed. As if someone, something, was inside the plate, pressing out. He whispered, "No, that's not possible." His own hands were still at his sides. The glass had not left the padded tray. Then came the crack. A thin, clean fracture traced its way across the glass, starting between Elric's boots and ending at the shoulder of his shadow. The split was too perfect, like a mirror being divided, not shattered. The room fell unnaturally silent. Even the hum of the light fixture above ceased. Alfred's breath caught as he saw it, just for a second. The shadow moved. Not as a flicker, not as a trick of light. It tilted its head, slowly, deliberately. and looked back at him. He stumbled back, knocking over the tray. The plate clattered to the floor but didn't break further. He didn't wait. He left everything behind: notes, gloves, his clipboard. He didn't even lock the cabinet. At 8:41 a.m., Alfred submitted his resignation. The letter was one line, handwritten in tight, angular script. It looked at me. The curators didn't argue. Years passed. The incident faded into rumor among archivists and staff. Most wrote it off as stress or exaggeration, or an overactive imagination in a cold room at the wrong hour. But then came the 1981 scan. A graduate researcher at Langdon University's folklore department was assembling a gallery of pub interiors from across England. One of the mirror panels taken inside a London tavern displayed something odd. In the far left pane between a coat rack and a wood stove was the outline of a child-sized shadow. No visible body, no child nearby. Just the shape, facing the camera. When the researcher overlaid the image with the Elric plate, the dimensions matched exactly. No matter the setting, no matter the time. The shadow did not age, did not fade, did not belong. So now the question lingers. Is it following us? Or are we the ones now standing in its path? If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe and turn on notifications for the next file. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It delves into themes of fear, superstition, and the thin line between innocence and the unknown. Its purpose is to provoke curiosity, inspire imagination, and explore how folklore reflects humanity's timeless fascination with darkness and mystery.